Joker 2, or Joker Folie, Deux, is one of 2024's most catastrophic box office bombs. But as easy as it would be to just sit back and attack everything wrong with the movie, instead I think it would be more constructive to outline what could have been a more effective sequel. After the original grossed over $1 billion worldwide on a $55 million production budget, we can see why investors were excited in the prospect of a sequel. But the real issue the potential franchise had is that the original was never built with a sequel in mind. It has more in common with Taxi Driver or The King of Comedy than Batman Begins or Man of Steel. In fact, one of the main criticisms Joker received was that while it worked as a good standalone movie, it had basically nothing to do with the famous Joker villain. Arthur Fleck was not an evil mastermind, he didn't have a twisted philosophy to follow, nor would he be an intimidating antagonist for Gotham to overcome. He was only the hero of his own story because the world around him was a villain, and that was something the audience could relate to in 2019. So that's why many of the story ideas that Folie Deux explored might sound like decent traditional sequels on paper, but flat out don't gel with the character they already created. Arthur doesn't have the charisma to be leading a Ted Bundy-esque trial of the century, nor does he have the emotional depth to be in an engrossing love story. And yet, that's what they went with. So let's see if we can tweak, edit, and ultimately fix Joker 2 to make it, okay, perhaps not great, but at least a more satisfying sequel for the audience. Step 1. No, it should not have been a musical. If you can't not just reveal but embrace the fact that it's a musical in your trailer or marketing campaign, then it looks like you have something to hide. And they did. Honestly, none of the music was necessary or even memorable. It just sort of starts happening during lackluster scenes, but it never feels like a welcome change of pace or a particularly inspired decision. Now, I'm not saying it's not possible to make an incredible Joker musical, but it wouldn't be with Arthur Fleck, nor would it be set in a prison or a courtroom. So if we cut the musical elements out of the script, what key story beats are we left with? Firstly, Arthur meets Lee in Arkham Asylum and they hit it off. Then his highly publicized murder trial begins, and he still has many fans supporting him wearing clown masks, reminding us that Arthur has inadvertently started a movement. As a defense, his lawyer is trying to plead insanity, as if Joker is a split personality of his. But the murder took place on live television, so this isn't exactly a compelling legal battle. Anyway, behind the scenes, Lee reveals she actually only checked herself into Arkham to meet Arthur, and is immediately already pregnant with his child. Okay, still not really a plot, but progress of sorts. Arthur then foolishly decides to abandon his defense lawyer and represent himself, and we then endure a relatively dull rotation of witnesses from the first movie, recounting Arthur's terrible behavior like the final episode of Seinfeld. So we're still not really adding anything, just circling back to reframe his crimes from the victim's perspective. Arthur does a predictably terrible job of representing himself throughout, and his closing statements are then a meltdown about how he regrets killing those people, and he admits that there is no Joker, it's just me. So this is a character arc of sorts. He's reflected on his crimes and realizes that, dun dun dun, murder is bad. But he doesn't really have any unique insights, as the character isn't insightful. However, this causes Lee to walk out, disappointed in Arthur for rescinding his Joker persona. And then just before his verdict gets read, a car bomb explodes, and he escapes out into Gotham City once again. Ooh, here we go. So what does he do? He wanders around aimlessly until he finds Lee, so she can reject him again. Okay, not really worth the explosion for this payoff, and then he just gets recaptured and sent back to Arkham again, where there's a final spoiler scene we'll discuss later. But just looking at the plot here, nothing much gets achieved throughout the film. Arthur only ends up undoing everything he built in the original. He then finds love, but loses it. And then when he gets freed, he doesn't really have anywhere to go or anything to do. And all of this just reinforces how impossible it is to write a compelling sequel about this character, because he's not really what anyone wants the Joker to be. He's just a mentally unwell man that finds himself in a position he doesn't belong. And director Todd Phillips seems very aware of that fact. So what could have been done differently to spice things up? Okay, well the first and most obvious option would be to turn him into the actual Joker, making the second movie a bridge from Arthur Fleck's Joker to the Joker we see in actual Batman movies. That instead of focusing on the trial, we follow his life in prison, where we see a similar pattern to the first movie, in which Arthur is being beaten up and ridiculed by prison guards and fellow inmates, which reignites our sympathy for him. But rather than being a patient herself, Lee could have been Arthur's psychiatrist, given Harley Quinn is meant to have studied psychiatry. Through their therapy sessions, she begins to understand Arthur on a deeper level, and even starts to empathize with his crimes. So she then uses her psychological skills for evil, and begins to bring out this darker, scheming side to him, maybe even hypnotizes him to block out some of Arthur's weaker impulses. This way we could start seeing Arthur scheming up ways to defend himself against his new tormentors. Just baby steps, of course, but enough to see that he has it in him. A romance would develop between patient and doctor, and then Lee could be the one to set off the bomb that frees Arthur in the end, and the two escape as heinous Bonnie and Clyde style villains. Now, I'm not saying it would be great, but it would be much more exciting. Although, admittedly, no matter what you do, it would still be highly implausible to transform Arthur into this intelligent, terrifying villain. Option 2. Given the original was criticised for borrowing from Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy, why not borrow from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest for the sequel? Arthur meets Lee in Arkham Asylum, and we see how poorly the mentally unwell patients get treated. They're not even trying to help them, just contain them. But these are not regular inmates. Instead, the asylum is populated with patients with personality traits that sync up with the Riddler, Catwoman, Poison Ivy, Scarecrow, and so on. And it's really a story of the inmates slowly taking over the asylum, with the ticking clock of Arthur's trial date looming in the background. The beating heart of the story could still be Lee and Arthur's blossoming romance, but the plot would be all of these antisocial characters coming together to form an escape plan. This way you wouldn't need Arthur to be the mastermind behind everything, and you'd be expanding the universe for more potential sequels while humanizing more famous villains. Now, don't get me wrong, it does sound a bit M. Night Shyamalan, but it would at least belong in the same gritty, dramatic tone as the original, where it's playing around with elements from the DC universe while never going full superhero mode. The third option is a critique of the role the media plays in radicalization. Folie lays the groundwork for a movie with something significant to say, but then never quite follows through. For instance, Lee tells Arthur that she must have watched the TV movie about him 20 times. Arthur is constantly interviewed by journalists hoping to make a name for themselves, and his trial is broadcast to the masses so that TV stations can cash in on the sinister story as much as possible. The film even opens with an animated sequence glorifying the Joker as if he's a red carpet celebrity. All of this attention then leads to his supporters blowing up the courthouse to free their hero. These elements of the story work well, or at least play into a broader theme. However, the story is being told from the wrong perspective. If the first Joker was about Arthur being radicalized by a world that mistreated him, then Joker 2 should be a movie about how giving mass murderers wall-to-wall attention breeds copycats. The film's primary focus should be on Lee, giving us a taste of her miserable life. Sick parents, debts, drug use, abuse, with no help in sight. And then she sees Arthur's live appearance on The Murray Franklin Show. We get to witness her raw, excited reaction as it unfolds in real time, and she then takes to the streets to join the riots. But then rather than watching the depressing truth of Arthur's unimpressive life in prison, instead we view it all through Lee's media consumption. How she can spend all her spare time reading about him in the newspapers, listening to coverage about him on the radio, and watching true crime documentaries that glorify him. We could even see how the basic interviews he does with journalists are then edited to make him look much more intimidating and charismatic than he really is, depicting someone much closer to the real Joker we've seen in other movies. This would all lead Lee to start mimicking her hero's journey, riding the subway late at night looking for trouble. The media then keeps on capitalizing on Arthur's story. A new animated series is commissioned, merchandise is sold, building a bigger and bigger following, with Lee spearheading the fandom, arranging underground meetings almost like Fight Club. Then as Arthur goes to trial, Lee sits and watches him in the courthouse every day. But her shy hero never speaks. Due to his illness, he only laughs, allowing her to project her own fantasies as to what he must be thinking. She then finally visits him in prison, and although he definitely does not live up to her expectations, she still sees something in him. When Harvey Dent publicly states that if there's any justice, Arthur will receive the death penalty, the media platforms Arthur so that he can respond, and his message ignites bloody riots in the streets. Citizens in clown masks storm government buildings, they loot local stores and burn down news stations. Amidst the chaos, Lee hunts down and kills Harvey Dent by throwing acid in his face. Then before Arthur's verdict is read, a car bomb blows up the courthouse and he escapes. But rather than being recaptured, he's taken away to safety by his toxic fans, yet again functioning as the icon of a movement he barely understands. I think this would probably be the most impactful alternative, as it would expand on the themes of radicalization covered in the original. And the title Joker 2 would then take on a double meaning of copycats continuing the cycle, and hold a mirror up to the role we each have to play in radicalization. As a final alternative, given the last scene in Folie Deux ends up with, spoiler alert, Arthur being murdered in prison by an inmate who's presumably the real Joker, then the movie could have also introduced this menacing Joker character earlier as the one who breaks him out of jail. This way, Arthur would come face to face with the social consequences of his actions. He would be taken away by a group of terrorists who presume that he's someone they can work with because of how he's been portrayed in the media. The real Joker would then be massively disappointed when he discovers that Arthur is just a mentally unwell man with no bad intentions or strategy for the future. He's weak. So then this new Joker could create a huge spectacle by publicly sacrificing Arthur in front of the media and his fans so that everyone now understands that he's the real deal. And as much as you might expect Arthur's fans and Lee to be upset that their hero was killed in such a horrifying way, instead their only question is who's that regarding the new Joker. As when it comes down to it, Arthur was only ever passive entertainment to them, or an emblem for a movement that will continue with or without him. The problem with this option is the same problem with the sequel itself. It's quite a tragic, grim, thankless ending for the character. Yes, Arthur dying is realistic, but it's undeniably depressing. So those are just a few alternative ideas to improve Joker 2, so that even if it didn't outshine the original, it would have functioned as a stronger piece of social commentary or even just entertainment than what we got. But I do have some sympathy for the filmmakers, as it's very difficult to make a sequel to a movie that doesn't demand one. And it's even harder to gauge what viewers even wanted from the Arthur Fleck story. Expanding the DC universe, action-packed excitement, a love story, a happy ending, gritty realism. It really could have gone in any direction and it still would have felt forced. But those are just some of my thoughts. How about you? When you heard they were making a Joker sequel, what story did you expect? What made you want to see it? Or what direction do you think it should have gone? Let me know in the comments section. And of course, if you made it this far, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, as it all ultimately helps the mysterious algorithm do its thing.